Imagine Rome not as a pile of ruins for tourists, but as it truly was, colossal, alive, throbbing with life. A center of power, where emperors dictated the fate of millions, where legions marched across continents, and the known world revolved around their commands. Now imagine that same Rome, plundered, violated, reduced to smoke and silence. Rome's fall wasn't a single event or a sudden collapse. It was a slow, corrosive process, shaped by bad decisions, internal betrayals, and foreign threats the empire ignored for far too long. In this video, we'll walk through that collapse, step by step. We'll discover who those so-called barbarians really were and why they were only the final chapter in a story that had been unraveling for centuries. Because every ruin has a beginning, and Rome's begins at its peak. In the 1st century AD, Rome seemed invincible. Under emperors like Augustus, Vespasian, and Trajan, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. From the forests of Britannia to the sands of Arabia, from the Rhine River to the heart of Mesopotamia, it was a giant, nearly 5 million square kilometers, with over 60 million people, 1 in every 4 humans on Earth, lived under Roman rule. The Pax Romana ensured 2 centuries of relative peace. Paved roads stretched across thousands of kilometers, connecting provinces from Spain to Syria. Massive aqueducts carried clean water to dry regions, feeding cities that housed hundreds of thousands of people. Roman laws, currency, language, and architecture fostered a shared identity. The legions kept order, trade flourished across the Mediterranean, and grain from Egypt fed the capital. Everything seemed to work, at least on the surface. But behind that facade of strength, something was already beginning to crack. The empire had grown too large to manage effectively. Every new province demanded more soldiers to protect it, more administrators to govern it, and more resources to sustain it. Its economy relied heavily on vast estates sustained by slave labor. But when Rome stopped expanding, the influx of new slaves slowed, and the system began to falter. The empire had been built on endless war, but when the conquests ended, the machine that kept it alive began to turn on itself. The state demanded more taxes to fund armies and public projects, while the free population sank into poverty. Year after year, the cost of maintaining the imperial apparatus exceeded what it could collect. By the 2nd century, the empire began to suffer a silent famine, not of food, but of money, of economic oxygen. Trade routes that once brought spices, silk, ivory, and precious metals from India, Africa, and deep into Europe began to falter. Constant wars, piracy in the Mediterranean, and instability in border regions made transportation dangerous and everything more expensive. Without steady tribute from distant provinces and without new lands to plunder, the empire plunged into a fiscal crisis. To keep paying for armies and monumental construction, the state began debasing its currency. Coins that had once contained solid gold or silver were now mixed with copper and other cheap metals. Inflation exploded, prices soared, sometimes doubling in mere weeks. A sack of grain that once cost a few denarii could become unaffordable overnight. Confidence in money vanished, and with it, trust in the imperial economy. The tax burden fell hardest on small landowners, artisans, and farmers. Many could no longer afford their obligations and lost their land. Others simply abandoned their farms, fleeing to cities or seeking protection from the wealthy. In this climate of desperation, a new social structure began to take shape. Thousands of ordinary Romans voluntarily submitted themselves to powerful landowners, offering their labor in exchange for shelter from tax collectors, from soldiers, and from bandits. This model of direct dependence, where peasants worked in exchange for protection, became the seed of what would later evolve into feudalism. Its roots lay here, in the failure of a state that could no longer guarantee justice, security, or even survival. The economic collapse didn't just weaken Rome, it redefined it. Out of desperation, a new order began to grow, one where power became local, wealth became private, and loyalty shifted from the emperor to whoever could offer safety. While the economy crumbled quietly, Roman politics was anything but silent. Starting in 235 AD, the empire entered a period historians would later call the military anarchy, or the crisis of the 3rd century. In just 49 years, over 20 emperors rose to power, most of them murdered, overthrown, or killed in battle. No regime was stable, no throne was safe. Generals were proclaimed emperors by their own troops, often after defeating rivals in the field. Military campaigns were no longer aimed at external enemies, they were civil wars. Roman fought Roman, legion clashed with legion, and province turned against province. Every corner of the empire tried to assert its own authority, and Rome's unity began to unravel from within. Meanwhile, with the legions consumed by infighting, the borders lay dangerously exposed. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine, the Sarmatians invaded Pannonia. Gothic raids devastated the Balkans and Asia Minor. Armed bands ravaged the countryside, burning villages and seizing supplies. Cities that had once thrived under imperial protection were left unguarded. The population feared not only the foreign invaders but also their own soldiers, who looted Roman towns and villas as if they were enemy territory. The historian Zosimus described this era as a time when Rome seemed to devour itself, and he wasn't exaggerating. Imperial authority was no longer respected. It was fought over like treasure. Power ceased to be a symbol of order and became a prize of war. To survive the chaos, Rome needed to reinvent itself. Its first attempt came with a drastic decision to divide the empire in two. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian instituted the Tetrarchy, a system of government with 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, the Caesares, each responsible for a different part of the empire. The plan was designed to make administration more efficient, to respond faster to invasions, and to prevent the rise of usurpers. In theory, it promised stability. In practice, Rome stopped functioning as a single, unified empire. It became 2 distinct worlds, East and West. The logic behind the division was primarily administrative. Each half would deal with its own crises, manage its own resources, and defend its own borders using its own armies and capitals. For a time, this structure brought stability and efficiency, but while it helped in the short term, it also created a deep fracture that would never truly heal. The Eastern Empire, with its major cities like Antioch, Nicomedia, and later Constantinople, was wealthier and better organized. Its provinces were densely populated, its economy diversified, and its trade routes stretched across Asia, the Red Sea, and the Black Sea. Gold from the east flowed steadily into the imperial treasury. Its cities were fortified, its administration more centralized, and its borders naturally protected by mountains and seas. The East had time, wealth, and infrastructure on its side. The Western Empire, by contrast, was increasingly fragile. Its capital shifted restlessly between Milan and Ravenna, seeking safety from the advancing frontiers. It faced endless invasions from the Rhine and Danube regions, irregular harvests that triggered famines, and a shrinking population devastated by war, plague, and economic decline. The once mighty legions of the West were chronically underfunded, often reduced to hiring mercenaries or barbarian auxiliaries to fill their ranks. While the East consolidated its authority and preserved its culture, the West was slowly bleeding out. Even the city of Rome, though still revered as the symbolic heart of the empire, had lost its political importance. The emperors no longer ruled from its marble palaces, and the Senate had become a shadow of its former self. What remained was prestige without power, and it was in this weakened Western Empire that the so-called barbarians found their opening. But who were they, really? To the Roman mind, the word barbarian was a convenient label, a way to classify anyone outside the Greco-Roman world, anyone who spoke strange, guttural languages, wore unfamiliar clothing, or refused to follow Roman laws and customs. But the word hid more than it revealed. The so-called barbarians were not a single people, nor were they uncivilized hordes driven purely by violence. They were a collection of diverse societies, each with its own traditions, alliances, and political ambitions. Many had complex systems of governance, rich oral traditions, and sophisticated craftsmanship. Among them were the Goths, divided into the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, semi-nomadic Germanic peoples who had interacted with Rome for generations, serving as soldiers and allies along its frontiers. There were the Vandals, who would later cross Gaul and Hispania before establishing a seaborne empire in North Africa. Alongside them stood the Saxons and Franks, expanding steadily along the Rhine frontier, and the Burgundians, who carved out their own kingdoms in Gaul. And looming over them all were the Huns, a nomadic confederation from the steppes of Central Asia, unmatched in speed, brutality, and sheer unpredictability. Yet these groups didn't initially want to destroy Rome. Many sought entry, not conquest. They wanted what Rome symbolized: land, security, trade, and legitimacy. Some were formally welcomed as allies, given the status of foederati, and granted rights to settle within imperial borders in exchange for military service. Barbarian leaders were even recognized as Roman officials, bestowed titles such as dux or comes, and invited to participate in imperial administration. For a while, this arrangement worked, but Rome's deep arrogance made true coexistence impossible. The empire saw itself as the center of the world, and everyone else as inferior. Even when the barbarians served loyally, they were treated as outsiders, often exploited and deceived by corrupt governors or greedy generals. Promised payments went undelivered, food supplies were withheld, and their families were mistreated. The fragile diplomacy that had kept peace for decades began to disintegrate. The peoples who had once stood at Rome's gates as supplicants would soon return as conquerors. The so-called barbarian invasions were not random waves of destruction. They were part of a vast and chaotic chain reaction, a human avalanche set in motion by forces beyond Rome's control. Entire nations were moving at once: tribes, clans, entire families with wagons, livestock, and everything they owned. These were not armies of conquest alone, but migrations of survival. They were fleeing something far more terrifying than Rome itself: the Huns. The Huns, a confederation of nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian steppes, burst into the fringes of Europe with unprecedented ferocity. They rode small, resilient horses, mastered the composite bow, and fought with tactics unfamiliar to Roman warfare. When they descended upon the Gothic tribes near the Danube, panic spread like wildfire. The Visigoths and Ostrogoths fled westward, begging the Roman Empire for asylum. Behind them came waves of Vandals, Alans and others, all pushed forward by the advancing Huns. But there were internal pressures as well. Many of these migrating peoples were already struggling with shortages of fertile land and growing populations. The lure of Roman territory, with its cities, farms and wealth, was irresistible. Even in decline, Rome remained a beacon of prosperity and order. To those on the outside, entering the empire meant survival, and perhaps even elevation. The problem was that Rome no longer had the strength to absorb them. The borders were thinly guarded, the bureaucracy corrupt, and the treasury nearly empty. Negotiations for safe settlement often broke down due to mismanagement, prejudice, or sheer incompetence. Promises of food and shelter were broken. Soldiers extorted refugees. What could have been integration turned into resentment, and resentment into war. As one group pushed another, migrations became unstoppable. The movement of one tribe displaced the next, creating a domino effect that swept across Europe. Some came peacefully, hoping to coexist under Roman authority. Others, driven by hunger or vengeance, came in search of plunder. But the empire, exhausted and divided, could no longer tell the difference. For centuries, Rome had relied on these same peoples to protect its borders. The foederati system allowed entire tribes to settle within imperial lands in exchange for military service. Many of Rome's best generals and soldiers were of barbarian descent, their loyalty bought through titles, land and gold. Some became indispensable, governing frontier provinces and even commanding Roman legions. Barbarian leaders married into Roman nobility, blending cultures in ways unimaginable a century before. On the surface it seemed like a stable arrangement, a merging of strength and necessity. Beneath that surface, however, tension simmered. The Romans never truly accepted these allies as equals. They were tolerated, not embraced. When crises struck, the empire's promises were abandoned, and its arrogance reasserted itself. Brutality replaced diplomacy, and corruption poisoned trust. That constant mistreatment eventually turned allies into enemies. The breaking point came in 378 AD at the Battle of Adrianople. The Visigoths, who had sought refuge within the empire from the Huns, were exploited and starved by Roman officials. Outraged, they rose in rebellion. Emperor Valens, underestimating their strength and refusing to wait for reinforcements, marched to confront them near Adrianople. The result was catastrophic. Valens was killed in battle, his body never recovered, and 2/3 of his army was annihilated. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor had fallen in open combat against a barbarian force. Adrianople was not just a military disaster, it was a psychological one. It shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility and marked a turning point in the empire's history. The so-called barbarians were no longer at Rome's borders, they were now inside its story, shaping its destiny. And as the Goths carved their place into history, an even more terrifying storm approached, a name that would haunt the empire forever: Attila. While Rome was still struggling to contain the Visigoths and Vandals, a new and far more formidable power was rising on the distant horizons of the Eurasian steppes. The Huns, a people of unmatched mobility and ferocity, were emerging as a nightmare that seemed almost supernatural to those who first encountered them. They were masters of mounted warfare, riding small but extraordinarily resilient horses that could cover vast distances without rest. Their composite bows, made from layers of horn and sinew, could pierce armor from hundreds of meters away. They struck without warning, disappeared into the plains as suddenly as they appeared, and left nothing but devastation in their wake. Even Rome's most battle-hardened soldiers trembled at their approach. The true terror began in 434 AD, when Attila rose to power. Unlike his predecessors, who had led loosely connected bands of warriors, Attila united the scattered Hun tribes into a single, disciplined and fearsome force. He imposed order on chaos, turning restless nomads into the backbone of a transcontinental war machine. But Attila was not merely a brute warrior, he was an intelligent and calculating leader, a shrewd diplomat who could manipulate his enemies as effectively as he could destroy them. He understood that Rome feared not only his armies but also his unpredictability. When it suited his interests, he negotiated with emperors and accepted lavish tributes. When it did not, he burned their cities to ash. Under Attila's command, the Huns stormed through the Balkans, besieged and plundered dozens of Roman towns, and drove the Eastern Empire to the brink of collapse. Constantinople itself was threatened, and to save the city, the Eastern Emperor Theodosius II agreed to pay an enormous annual tribute in gold. But gold only fed Attila's ambitions. Once he had exhausted the East, he turned his gaze westward, toward the crumbling half of the empire that was already gasping for air. Wherever his armies marched, fields turned to wastelands, cities emptied, and survivors carried tales of horror that grew more dreadful with each retelling. Roman chroniclers struggled to describe the scale of destruction. They called him Flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, not out of reverence, but because they could find no other explanation for such an unstoppable wave of destruction. To them, Attila seemed less a man than a divine punishment sent upon a sinful world. In 451 AD, he launched his most daring campaign yet, the invasion of Gaul. This was not merely a raid for plunder, it was a deliberate strategic attempt to shatter the Western Roman Empire once and for all. His armies swept across the countryside, seizing city after city. Panic spread through the provinces as refugees poured into fortified towns, and even those who had once fought alongside Rome now doubted the empire's survival. But amid the despair, an unexpected alliance emerged. Flavius Aetius, one of the last truly capable Roman generals, realized that Rome alone could not face Attila. Drawing upon his long experience with diplomacy and warfare, he rallied the Visigoths under King Theodoric I, along with remnants of Roman legions and other federated peoples who still clung to the empire's promise. Together they met Attila on the Catalonian plains, an immense confrontation that would become one of the bloodiest battles of late antiquity. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Theodoric was killed in combat, his warriors driven by grief to fight with renewed fury. Attila, facing unexpected resistance and heavy losses, was forced to retreat. Though he escaped with part of his army intact, the Huns' aura of invincibility had been dented. Rome, barely standing, had survived by a thread. That fragile victory, however, brought little relief. The very next year, in 452 AD, Attila returned, this time descending upon Italy itself. The cities of the north were ravaged. Aquileia, one of the wealthiest and most fortified towns, was wiped off the map so completely that later generations could scarcely find its ruins. The destruction spread like an infection across the peninsula. Famine followed, disease stalked the survivors, and the empire's resources were stretched beyond breaking. Rome once again faced annihilation. Then came an event so strange it entered the realm of legend. As Attila advanced toward the city, Pope Leo I rode out to meet him in person. No one knows what transpired during their encounter. Ancient writers spoke of divine visions, of the apostles Peter and Paul appearing beside the Pope, commanding Attila to turn back. Others suggest that the meeting was far more pragmatic. Leo offered gold, promises, or threats of plague and famine. Whatever the truth, Attila withdrew. For the second time in living memory, Rome was spared, but fate gave the empire no lasting reprieve. Just 2 years later, Attila died suddenly, reportedly on the night of his wedding. His vast confederation, held together only by his authority, collapsed almost overnight as rival chiefs tore it apart. Yet the scars he left upon the empire were permanent. Rome had survived physically, but spiritually and psychologically, it was broken. The illusion of control, the aura of eternal strength, had been shattered beyond repair. In truth, the fall had begun even before Attila's shadow reached Italy. Decades earlier, in 410 AD, the unthinkable had already occurred. The Eternal City, untouched by foreign enemies for nearly 8 centuries, had fallen. The conqueror was not an alien invader from the steppes, but a former ally of Rome itself, Alaric, king of the Visigoths. For years, Alaric had served Rome faithfully. He fought as a general in Roman campaigns, negotiated in good faith, and demanded only what had been promised to him: fair payment and recognition. Yet he was repeatedly deceived and humiliated by imperial officials who saw him as little more than a barbarian tool. Each betrayal deepened his resentment until, realizing that Rome would never treat him as an equal, he decided to take by force what diplomacy could not win. By this time, Rome was no longer the administrative center of the empire, but it remained its heart, the sacred symbol of all that the empire represented. When Alaric's forces surrounded the city, its defenses were weak and morale shattered. Hunger and desperation opened the gates. For 3 days, the Visigoths looted temples, mansions, warehouses, and monuments. Yet Alaric's sack was measured, not wanton. There was no wholesale slaughter, no burning of the city, but the psychological effect was catastrophic. Across the Roman world, the news spread like a shockwave. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, cried out in despair, "The world is collapsing." To many it felt as if civilization itself had ended. Alaric had not destroyed Rome's buildings, he had destroyed its myth, the centuries-old belief that the eternal city could never fall. That illusion, once broken, could never be restored. The Visigoths had proven that Rome was mortal, and their victory set a precedent others would follow. For if the city of Rome could be humbled once, it could be humbled again. 45 years later, the Vandals would prove it. With even greater precision and devastation, Rome would once again be plundered. But this time, the conquerors would come not by land, but from the sea. In 455 AD, Genseric, king of the Vandals, crossed the Mediterranean with a formidable fleet of warships, their sails darkening the horizon as they approached the Italian coast. The Vandals had built a powerful maritime empire based in North Africa, controlling key trade routes and possessing one of the most efficient naval forces of the age. With precise planning, Genseric landed his forces near the Tiber and advanced directly toward Rome, the once mighty heart of the empire that now stood vulnerable and exposed. Rome was utterly defenseless. Its legions, once the pride of the ancient world, had long since disbanded or defected to foreign service. The imperial treasury was empty, the administrative system collapsing under corruption and disunity. Just days before Genseric's arrival, Emperor Petronius Maximus had been murdered by an angry mob as he tried to flee the city. Leaderless and panicked, the Roman Senate and clergy could do little but await the inevitable. With no army to defend it, and no emperor to command it, the Eternal City opened its gates once again. For 14 days, the Vandals carried out a calculated and systematic plundering of Rome. Unlike the Visigoths under Alaric, whose sack decades earlier had been driven by hunger and desperation, Genseric's campaign was deliberate and meticulously organized. His men moved from district to district, taking what they wanted but avoiding unnecessary slaughter or destruction. They sought out the city's greatest treasures: gold, silver, jewels, sacred vessels, fine textiles, and art that had adorned Rome's temples and palaces for centuries. They even seized the legendary spoils of Jerusalem, the sacred relics brought to Rome by Emperor Titus after the destruction of the Second Temple nearly 400 years earlier. Genseric's men also captured high-value hostages, including the widowed Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her 2 daughters. These captives would serve not only as bargaining chips in future negotiations, but also as symbols of the Vandals' dominance. To take the emperor's widow was to strike at the last shred of Roman prestige. Once their ships were laden with treasure and prisoners, the Vandals withdrew, leaving the city stripped of its wealth and humiliated before the world. Once again, Rome had escaped total physical destruction. Its walls still stood, its people still lived, but the city's soul was hollowed out. The marble columns gleamed less brightly, the forum stood silent, and the streets that once echoed with the triumphs of legions now whispered of loss and shame. The sack of 455 marked not just the plundering of a city, but the symbolic collapse of its dignity and moral authority. The cultural impact of that event was profound. Over the centuries, the word Vandal ceased to refer to a distinct people and became synonymous with mindless, senseless destruction. Ironically, Genseric's actions had been disciplined and purposeful, but collective memory transformed his name into a byword for barbaric ruin. It was as if history itself could not bear the humiliation of Rome's defeat and had to recast it as an act of blind chaos. By that time, Rome was no longer the capital of the empire. The imperial court had long since moved to Ravenna, a city more defensible amid marshes and protected by the Adriatic Sea. Yet even without its political power, Rome remained the spiritual and cultural heart of the empire, the eternal symbol of Roman identity, and now that heart was empty, its authority reduced to memory and myth. 2 decades later, in 475 AD, a new and unlikely emperor took the Western throne, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. His name carried the weight of destiny. Romulus, like the legendary founder of the city, and Augustus, like the empire's first and greatest ruler. Yet the irony was cruel. This young emperor would not found a new Rome. He would preside over its final collapse. Romulus was placed on the throne by his father, Orestes, a Roman Germanic general who had risen through the ranks of the imperial army. The boy was little more than a puppet, ruling a realm that was Roman in name only. The Western Empire he inherited had neither the strength nor the structure of the past. Its legions were composed largely of mercenaries, its borders were indefensible, and its finances were in ruins. From his residence in Ravenna, Romulus presided over a fading shadow of what had once been the most powerful state in the world. In 476 AD, everything finally unraveled. Odo Acer, a Germanic chieftain commanding federated troops in Italy, demanded land for his soldiers as payment for their service. When Orestes refused, Odo Acer gathered his forces, marched on Ravenna, and swiftly defeated the imperial army. Orestes was executed, and young Romulus was deposed without a fight. There was no last stand, no burning of the city, no hero's death. The end of Rome came quietly, almost politely. Odo Acer spared the boy's life, perhaps recognizing that there was no need for cruelty. Romulus was granted a modest estate and a pension, living out his remaining days in obscurity. His disappearance from history marked not just the end of a reign, but the end of an era. Odo Acer then performed an act that symbolized the final dissolution of the Western Roman Empire. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple cloak, and the scepter, to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, declaring that Italy no longer required a separate emperor. The Roman world had come full circle. Power now rested solely in the East, while the West dissolved into a mosaic of barbarian kingdoms. There had been no decisive battle, no cataclysmic event, only a slow, inevitable decay. The greatest empire in Western history had fallen, not from conquest alone, but from within, corroded by arrogance, political chaos, and the gradual loss of purpose that had once made Rome great. And yet, even as the Western Roman Empire vanished, Rome itself refused to die. Its fall was an ending, but also a beginning. The collapse of imperial rule in 476 AD did not erase the vast cultural and intellectual legacy Rome had built. Its laws continued to shape justice, its language evolved into the Romance tongues of Europe, and its architectural and engineering marvels inspired generations of builders. Its religion, once persecuted and later embraced, became the unifying faith of medieval Christendom. The Eastern Roman Empire, known to history as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly 1,000 more years, preserving and transforming the essence of Roman civilization. In the West, new kingdoms arose on the ruins of the old order. Germanic rulers adopted Roman titles and institutions, while Christian monks painstakingly copied manuscripts of Latin authors, ensuring that Rome's memory would outlive its power. The medieval world that emerged from Rome's ashes was more rural, fragmented and unstable than what came before. Yet beneath its shifting surface, the foundations of Rome remained embedded in law, language, faith, and imagination. In every cathedral built with stones taken from ancient temples, in every Latin prayer whispered by monks, in every vision of empire dreamt by kings, Rome still lived. Rome kept whispering. If this video gave you a new perspective on how empires truly fall and how they can live on in other forms, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. What moment do you think truly marked the end of Rome, and what lessons from its fall still guide you in battle?